Today, we will be speaking with Nicole Belolan, who is a public historian in residence at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Center for Humanities at Rutgers University-Camden. At Rutgers, she directs a continuing ed program in historic preservation, which sounds like some folks have participated in. As part of her appointment, she's also the co-editor of The Public Historian and the digital media editor for the National Council on Public History. Nicole is also a historian of material culture of disability in early America. She regularly lectures and gives workshops on disability history and best practices for museums and historic sites. And she's also the secretary of the Disability History Association. So real expert on this topic. I am going to now start to interview her. So Zoom's a little bit weird. Nicole, I lost you. Are you still on?
I am here, yes.
Oh, you're there. Okay.
Yeah.
I see you. Okay, so I'm going to pin you, spotlight you for everyone, and then we'll start our conversation so everyone can see you. So, all right. So, Nicole, how did you first get interested in accessibility and preservation, as well as disability history and that subject in general?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me here today. I'm excited to talk about this topic and share some of the things that I've learned along the way, but also want to hear from all of you about your experiences with accessibility and inclusion, because I am always learning. How did I get interested? Well, it all started back in grad school. I went through the Winterthur program in American Material Culture, and there are two projects that I did there that got me interested in disability history. So for example, the first research project I did was about early American clothes stools. And if you're not familiar with those, they are fancy pieces of furniture that you can use to conceal chamber pots. So you can use the restroom, for example, in the middle of the night. And I started to get, when I was researching that, one of the things I did was I was looking for mentions of clothes stools in any early American writing. And Elizabeth Drinker, who was a Quaker who wrote a lot about her everyday life in Philadelphia in the 18th and 19th century in early America, she wrote a lot about, mentioned using the clothes stool a lot, and detailed one of her family members' illnesses and talked about how she was helping that person up to the stool. And so I started to think about chronic illness and how people related to the objects that they used in their homes, and how they needed to also use other people to deal with, live with, and manage chronic illness and disability. And then I started my master's research on my thesis, and I was researching this woman who really liked Berlin needlework, which is a type of 19th century needlework made into mottos you can put on the wall and suspenders and shoes and all sorts of things. And she was chronically ill most of her life. She lived in Philadelphia in the early 19th century, and she used needlework to stay in touch with friends and family while she was chronically ill at home, and presumably couldn't get out as easily as some other people might have. So then I started thinking more about illness and disability and chronic illness, and again, how people used objects to live with physical disability. And that's sort of what morphed into my dissertation research, which ended up being about disability and material culture in early America. And what I learned was that lots of people who study disability history, which is a relatively new field, maybe 20 or 30 years old or so, lots of them identify as disabled themselves. I don't, but many of them do, and they're often advocates for disabled people. And so if you go to conferences on disability history, you'll often see people advocating for accessible presentations, for example, which is something that I never knew anything about until the last couple years. And so I learned best practices in giving an accessible presentation. So for example, if we were in person and I were giving maybe a more scholarly talk with lots of slides, I would pass out large print copies of my talk ahead of time so that the audience could follow along, because that's easier for some people to listen and read. In some cases, if someone is deaf or hard of hearing, then they can follow along that way too. They can look at the images up close. Sometimes technology doesn't work really well and you can't see slides well. So it's great to have them be passed around. So I started learning all of these things that people did to make history, broadly defined, more accessible as I was studying disability history. And I, at the same time, was doing a lot of work with small museums and historic sites, and started to learn that not everyone, but lots of people who worked for them, and large museums too, didn't necessarily know about accessibility and how you can make history broadly defined accessible for disabled people. So then I started doing workshops on it. And I also, one of the things that I like to do is historicize disability so that we learn why, and I'll talk more about this probably later, why we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, federal law passed in 1990. Because in the 19th century, many Americans were institutionalized. In the early 20th century, there are lots of laws that got disabled people off the street and lots of immigration restrictions keeping disabled people out of the United States. And we're still very much living with that legacy. And I think lots of people who aren't familiar with the disability community don't necessarily think about serving that population. I certainly didn't before I started this research. And so I like to try to help people learn more about what that history is all about, why we want to serve people with disabilities, and how to do that with the resources that we have.
That's really interesting, like historicized disability, because you're right, I don't think some of those stories get told probably as much as, anywhere as much as they need to be. I know it's something I'm not familiar with myself, which was partially why I wanted to bring you onto Q&A with P&J, because it's so interesting, and you seem to be kind of really like in the cutting edge of all these studies and bringing it to more audiences. So what does, and because I know the topic for this talk was kind of broad, right? It's just accessibility and historic preservation. So what does accessibility in historic preservation look like, right? So you mentioned some of the times like what maybe a lecture in history would look like. What are some other ways that accessibility and historic preservation intersect?
You can take many forms. So it can be having a wheelchair ramp or some sort of wheelchair access to a historic building. It can be providing an audio guide for people who are blind or have low vision, if you're talking about a museum setting. And I can give you more specific examples too, but I just want to say that all of these things are informed by, I think, two big frameworks. One is legal and one is ethical or moral. So as I mentioned earlier, the legal framework is the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in 1990. And I will be talking a little bit about law, but I just want to throw out there that I'm not an attorney, and that if you have any legal questions, you should consult your lawyer. But the ADA is super important, passed in 1990. It's civil rights legislation requiring equal access for all in public and private space. And lots of accessibility training starts by saying, this is the law, we all need to follow it, which is super important. But again, I like to bring in the history to help us remember why we got here in the first place. Also because in early America, which is the period that I'm more familiar with, disabled people were actually really well integrated into everyday life. And so I think that we can use that history as sort of inspiration for what we're doing today. So anyway, so you have the legal framework, of course, but then you also have the ethical and moral and professional framework to provide access to culture. And lots of people here are probably familiar with the, having to balance what we call preservation and access. So the preservation of artifacts, oral histories, buildings themselves, and then providing that access to people. So through research, as visitors to a historic site, staff. And accessibility is, for disabled people, is one form of that access. And I think the hallmarks of accessibility and inclusion are, one, going beyond what the ADA asks of us. Two, to include disabled people in all of the programming, the planning that you're doing to make your history accessible. And if you'd like, I could go through some examples of what I usually talk about in in training for stuff that, to make history as accessible as possible.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Sure, yeah. So first of all, I always tell people it's okay to start with the little things. I think sometimes people get nervous about having to address, a federal law. But if you don't start somewhere, of course, you'll never provide any accessibility services for people. So it's okay to start with the little things, and you can break it down by, physical access and programmatic access, which are two really big umbrellas, but it's a good way to, break things down. And, you can couch it as, again, this balance of preservation and access. And in the museum field, which is where I come from, primarily, we've been talking about access for years, and museum educators are really great at providing multimodal access to history through objects, through all sorts of things. And accessibility is not just about disability, it's also about financial accessibility. It's about language accessibility. So this is something that the field is already thinking and talking about. I just don't think we're thinking enough about the disabled people. And that's really important because this sort of accessibility and inclusion benefits not just only disabled people, but everyone. So I'll talk about some of the things that you can do, anyone can do, and not just people working at historic sites, but in your own office setting, to make everything more accessible. So of course we have first physical access, and that's obviously super important for wheelchair users in particular. And an obvious way to make a building more accessible is to provide access for a wheelchair user, for example. But when it comes to programmatic access, then there's like a really big list of things that you can do. So the first thing I would say is to familiarize yourself with the latest language you want to use when you're referring to disabled people. It's something that changes all the time, and it's not something that a lot of people are familiar with. And I'll drop in the chat one of my favorite resources on that. It's produced by a journalism organization.
Oh, great.
The second thing you can all do is whenever you're providing a Word document about anything, sharing it with a coworker, posting it to your website, maybe you're posting a listing of upcoming tours for your site or something. Always post that as a Word doc and as a PDF. One of the things I've learned is that people who are blind or have low vision, some prefer to increase text using the zoom, like the percentage, but some like to use, for example, their fingers on an Apple device, and that's more easily done with a PDF usually. So it's great to include both of those documents. And the other thing you should do is make sure that the Word document is accessible. And you can Google how to make accessible Word document and figure that out pretty quickly. One of the hallmarks is to have typeface that's 16 point or bigger. Arial is a really good typeface to use because it's easy to read for most people. And you want to use headings. And that's, again, something that you can reference pretty quickly. When it comes to social media, that can be made more accessible. Maybe some of you are already doing this by using alternative text. Alternative text is a way of describing images so that if somebody who is accessing that social media and they have a screen reader, then it will more easily pick up on those images. If you're putting any videos out in the world, like on YouTube or something, or on your website, you want to provide closed captions that you have made in-house, because the ones that YouTube does automatically and the ones that Zoom can do automatically are not super accurate, which many of you have probably seen. And there are guides about how to do that on the internet that are pretty accessible. And you also want to provide transcripts with that. So for example, I did this little series that I'm still working on called The Public Historian at Home. And I put that into the chat, and you'll see that I've included transcripts and resources with all of those videos. Another thing I like to advocate for is both in person and for online events, it's great to have live time, what's called Cartcaptioning, so communication access real-time translation. This really helps to improve the quality of the captioning that's being done for events. And again, this helps people who are deaf or hard of hearing. It helps people who have cognitive disabilities. It makes it easier for them to process information. helps me process information better personally, especially when you're, watching video all the time. Maybe you just want to not look at the video and just read the words. It's just a lot more accessible for lots of people.
And you said that's called Cartcaptioning?
Yep, CART.
Okay.
And it stands for Communication Access Real-Time Translation.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Another thing I would add is that if you have a historic site or a museum or even a business, it's really good practice to say what kind of accommodations people can expect when they visit. So for example, if you're at a historic site and let's say you have multiple buildings, tell people ahead of time if there are steps going up to a certain building, if one has a wheelchair ramp and the other doesn't. And a really good example of this is this resource done by Old Salem in North Carolina. The whole program is called Access Salem. And if you click on that link I put in there, you'll see a PDF that lists all of their historic buildings and tells you what kind of accessible ways people can engage with all of them. And then of course, for in-person events, always insist on microphone usage. As I mentioned earlier, have people bring large print copies of their talk to help people in the audience process stuff who want to process stuff differently, pass around images so people can see them close up. And also I say check out the Mutter Museum. One thing they did is, of course, it's hard to have someone on staff all the time who is an ASL user. So what they did was that they generated a tour and then had someone deliver it in American Sign Language. And then they put that on an iPad. So if somebody came to the museum and needed an ASL tour, there's your tour right there. You can just carry it around with you. So there are lots of really innovative things out there that people have done. And lots of these tips and tricks that I mentioned are very easy to do and something that most places can implement right away.
I love the example that you gave of the ASL kind of video tour at the museum, because you're right. Somebody might think, oh, well, financially, this isn't feasible to have somebody on staff all the time that can do the ASL tour, but that's a fantastic, it's kind of a workaround, I think, but it also works. It sounds like it's a successful program that they have created. Can you give folks a couple more? I think these like real life examples are really helpful. And I don't know if there's any that are like in New Jersey that people could go visit. I think like what you're talking about, the balance between preservation and access is fascinating, right? Like with all the heritage sites that may be on this call, like, are there some people that you think are really striking the right balance that we could look at?
Other places, and if someone listening is doing some great accessibility work, please let me know, because I'd like to use you as an example in the future, or maybe somebody wants to jump in and tell us all what they're doing. I'd love to hear. But I'll mention some other examples. Let me think. Well, no, that's all right. I already used up some of my examples. Well, let me, this isn't local, but the National Council on Public History, which I work for, did a disability working group a couple of years ago, and there are a couple of interesting case studies in there that people might find interesting. So I put that into the chat. And I also want to mention this quick essay by Cindy Folk at the Cooperstown program about accessibility. So she gives you a good overview. It's really short and it's a good read and quick overview of why accessibility and inclusion is important. And she puts it within the context of the practice of public history, broadly defined. The Museum of the American Revolution, where my husband happens to work there, so that's why I'm familiar with their resources, but they have a page on accessibility with some touch tour info and handouts about that. I would encourage everybody to reach out to their community. So anyone in the community who might identify as disabled, or if they know someone who's disabled, and ask them what they need and what they want. Bonnie put into the chat, the Cultural Access Network website has resources for organizations looking to improve ADA accessibility, and that they run workshops. Thanks, Bonnie, for including that. There's another organization that I've worked with before called Outreach. They're Philadelphia based, but they do, oops, I think I just put in wrong. that's the wrong website. Outreach.
I'm impressed by the links. You're ready.
They're
helpful.
Outreach is a great organization, and they do all sorts of things. I believe they'll do things like they would review your website for language in particular related to disability, since that's something a lot of people are not familiar with. They also do training for staff about how to interact with people with disabilities, if you're not familiar with what that etiquette looks like. They're a really wonderful resource also. And anything else? If anyone else has any examples they'd like to share from their own work or from other places that they've encountered, I'd love to know. I mean, I think one of the important things that you can do in this field is to learn from each other.
Definitely. So yeah, with that, why don't we, I know I have a couple more questions, but I'd love to open it up to if anybody, because we do have some people on the call that sounds like this is also their field. So it's a nice time to kind of maybe have a little bit of a discussion of some best practices that other people have seen. I'm going to unspotlight. Let's see if I can do it so that we can see each other. Maybe I can't. Okay. Do people see each other? Okay. Okay. If anybody would like to speak or share best practice or ask a question, feel free to at this time. I know I have a couple more myself, but let's open it up and have a conversation. So if you want to use the hand raise feature, you can, let's see, oh, maybe that's for webinar. So why don't you just kind of drop in the chat that you'd like to speak, and then we'll call on you. A lot of people don't have their cameras on. It'd be hard to know otherwise. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments?
While people are coming up with questions and thoughts, another best practice I forgot to mention is that lots of people appreciate it if in an online session like this that you actually describe yourself before you start talking. So for example, I might say I'm a white woman in my mid-30s. I have long brown hair and glasses. I have a screen with fabric behind me and my basement, you know, to give people a sense of the scene. Yeah.
And actually, I just thought the raise hand function is available underneath reactions. So I was just checking on that. While folks think, I actually had a question, Nicole, that came up kind of like in the beginning, but I didn't want to go off my script so fast. You mentioned that in, years in parts of our history, folks with disabilities were very well integrated into society. Could you explain what you meant by that? I thought that was an interesting kind of statement, and I wanted to hear more about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, disability is a different experience depending on the person and the time and the place and the resources and race and all sorts of things. But in early America, I think one word you could use to describe that time period is that it was a little more flexible in a way. And so, there were far fewer institutions, asylums, places for people with mental and cognitive disabilities. They were just a part of the community. That is still the case, and still was the case in the 19th century, but there are far more people who were set apart from everybody else. And that was enabled by a number of factors. Lots of work took place in the home. It was just a different, pre-industrial society, I think, enabled that more readily. But also, when I say it was a time that was more flexible, the stuff people used to live with disability was more flexible in a way too. So for example, if you think of crutches, which is one of my favorite things to think with, to talk about, usually I have one with me, but they're upstairs. I forgot to bring one downstairs today. But for example, in the 18th century, crutches were made of wood. And let's say that I used crutches when I broke a bone, and then we kept them around the house. And then let's say somebody who was shorter than I am needed to use them after me. Well, it's a lot easier to, adjust a wooden crutch at home than it is to adjust, say something made of metal that you might be getting today from, a chain pharmacy or something like that. So, I mean, I can include, many, many, many more examples, but that's, a sense of what I'm talking about when I say that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. Does anyone have any specific questions about maybe something going on at their site? This is a good opportunity to get those answered. Oh, Gail has her hand up. Gail?
I just had a question with regards to what was just said. Now, I was under the impression that people with disabilities back in earlier times had a much more difficult time in society, that they weren't integrated in like they are now. I mean, now if you have a disability, people don't look at you askew or treat you any differently. But whereas back in the day, I thought if you had a disability, you were almost cast out of society, that you weren't integrated in there. Where am I going wrong with the thinking of that?
That's a great question, Gail. And I think what you're thinking of is more of the mid to late 1800s and early 20th century, when disabled people were more likely to be set apart from the rest of society. I was referencing the 1700s, and even before that, that's when people tended to be better integrated, disabled people tended to be better integrated into society. And if you want to learn more about the mid to late 19th century and the early 20th century, in terms of disability and people being set apart, I recommend highly a book by Doug Bayton called Defectives in the Land. Just holding it up right here. I'm teaching a class on this right now, which is why, and actually we just read this last night. So this is very much at the top of my brain and was even on my desk. So I recommend highly this book, Defectives in the Land. And also to talk more about institutionalization, another book called The Life of Anna Ott, Money, Marriage, and Madness by Kim Nielsen. This is also a great book about institutionalization in the 19th century. And then for an earlier time period, there's stuff by me. And another guy I really like, I love his work, Dan Blackie has written a bit about Revolutionary War soldiers and disability. And what he assumed going into his research, and I'm happy to send more info on this if anyone wants to contact me. What Dan Blackie found going into his research was, he assumed that disabled Revolutionary War soldiers might not have been able to provide adequately for their families. But in fact, he found the opposite, that there wasn't much difference between disabled soldiers and non-disabled soldiers after the war. And in fact, that disabled Revolutionary War soldiers themselves provided care for other people. So it's really in the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century that we start to see people in the United States, at least, as I said, starting to segregate disabled people. Not everybody did this, but it was definitely a trend.
Wow, thank you for all that information.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
That's really
interesting.
Can
I say at this point? Hi, it's Bonnie.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, my sort of recently have been working with the mid 1800s, and to this point, I think you see a big change in how the disabled were integrated into society when the Industrial Revolution started to take effect, because prior to that, you had a lot of families in the home, and a lot of the industry was home-based, and there wasn't, it was sort of a take care of your family. And when it became necessary for people to leave that home-based kind of society, as it did when the Industrial Revolution started to take place, people were going into cities, and then it became harder, I think, to manage people with disabilities in that city situation instead of, say, on the farms or in home-based activities like weaving and things of that nature. So I'm sort of sort of see this movement of the taking care of the disabled person or finding them an occupation within the home industry. And then when it moved into the city in a more industrialized area, that's when I think you see these problems occurring. Like, how do we integrate the people into that kind of a industrialized society? I don't know if Nicole agrees with that.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. You know, industrialization played a huge role in how it changed how disabled people were involved with society. Another great book that might be of interest is called No Right to Be Idle, The Invention of Disability in the 1840s, from the 1840s to the 1930s. And I'll just put that in the chat too, and deals with a lot of those issues that you're mentioning.
Yeah. You know, I've been lucky enough that I started with issues with people with disabilities 20 years ago when I started working at a museum. And this became, I was lucky enough to meet the people at the Cultural Access Network, which is part of the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. It actually works with them in order to get, you know, as you said, when the ADA laws came into effect. And I've also worked in a history museum. And the thing that I find there's a book that I still think you can download it. It's called Everyone's Welcome, and that's for organizations in the arts, and it really it's huge, but it gives you a great idea of how to integrate all sorts of things, not only your programs, but your buildings concerns, and you know, your whenever you start a project that has to do with building, you also have a lot of onuses on the organization to make sure that they do it. It's a little more difficult, I think, with historical organizations, because you have that other layer of, you have to make sure that you are, when you're say adding on to a site or you're trying to make it accessible, that you cannot impinge upon the historical significance of the site either. And for us at the Historic Village at Allaire, what was also an issue, and I'm sure it is with some other people, when you have two-story buildings that have no accessibility on the top story, then it becomes also, how do you let what you keep on the top story, on the second story, accessible or enjoyed by the people who cannot get upstairs, or you know, and that becomes a whole nother issue. And of course, you just can't put an elevator in a historic building and say, there you go. So there's a lot of challenges, I think, that historians have when they're on a historical site that are really sort of interesting and scary to to start dealing with.
Thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, I am familiar with that publication you mentioned. And, you know, I would encourage everyone to think about accessibility inclusion as a fun, creative exercise in making your site more accessible. And one thing I really like about, there's a professor at Vanderbilt University who's also a design historian of disability and accessibility. There are a lot of great, interesting theories going on in design that can help us, we can use as tools in historic preservation. And their name is Amy Hamray, and they did this whole project called Mapping Disability Access, I believe, and I'll try to get that link for you as I talk. And one of the things that they like to emphasize is sometimes the inclination might be to, if you want to make a building more accessible, you know, add a wheelchair ramp around the side or around the back. Again, going back to that sort of old-fashioned practice of segregating disabled people from society. And what I like about a design disability justice perspective on these sorts of projects is that they tend to center disability instead of putting it to the side. And so, for example, they did things where they, I just saw them give a talk on this. They actually made changes to the landscaping around the building to help bring people's focus to the accessible entrances instead of the ones with steps. So I think sometimes the tendency can be to hide these things, but instead I think one of the trends in the field is to try to celebrate them and make them exciting and something that everyone can use, and not necessarily just a wheelchair user. Yeah, I think there is at least one other hand.
There's a hand. Yep. Dan Lincoln has his hand up.
That was me.
Both hands.
Yeah. Well, no, I just wanted to bring up a point that, because Bonnie's mention about the Industrial Revolution really made me think that also the medical profession kind of rose a little bit at the same time as science advanced, along with a lot of the industries, and really were kind of responsible in a lot of ways for probably the separation of people who should not be seen, so to speak, in both mental and physical type of approaches. So, let us thank them. I mean, I think I don't want to say they had to, but because of the Industrial Revolution, families couldn't always take care of their own so much. And so, somebody had to. And I am not happy with a lot of things that took place, but it is part of the history, and hopefully we all learn from our mistakes and are doing much better now. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I see somebody has something in the comment section from a little bit ago, and then we'll go to you, Gail, because I see your hand up as well. Todd says, I am familiar with Culture City, a group that helps create sensory accessibility. I was impressed with them, but it is not a free service. Does anyone know about other sources for creating a sensory-friendly environment? So I don't know if Nicole, you have any other sources, or somebody else in the group as well. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would look to see what other places have done and use that as inspiration. And then you could, try to recreate it, again, using disabled people themselves to help create something that's considered sensory friendly. There are cases where you will have to, pay for accessibility at times. You could always try partnering with a university to see if anyone's teaching a class who might be able to help you design a program in partnership with your institution. There's a technical leaflet available through AASLH, the American Association of State and Local History, about using 3D printing to make certain historical artifacts more accessible to people who might be blind or have low vision. And that was done with a university partnership. So, and then of course there are grants too. So there are a lot of, I think, different possibilities and routes you can go there, some creative funding and collaborative options.
That's interesting. So you're saying you could 3D print a historical object in a museum so that people that can't see it can touch it. That's something that is happening in the field right now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's, I don't know if it's super common, but it's definitely a tool that people are using. Mm-hmm. And also there's a trend there are some trends to lead towards where people are touching historic artifacts. And also some places are printing paintings in relief. So that's another option, or design, or I guess producing relief versions of paintings. And I'm trying to think what else. And this is actually something that museums have been doing since the early 20th century. The Met Museum in New York, for example, was an early leader in accessible programming, and as was the Natural History Museum there also.
Interesting, thanks. Gail has another question.
Sure.
Yes, I was just thinking about the what you said about the wheelchair ramps and going around and mm-hmm. to the back and to the side. The problem with some of those type of ramps is that, for one thing, they're really long. They make them really long, and they sort of incline uphill. So now if a person with the wheelchair is using that, I don't use a wheelchair, so I don't know, but it would seem like it would be a little difficult because it's going uphill. But if you take a person that has crutches, that makes it even worse for them. I mean, they could actually slip and fall. So I don't know, maybe but why is it when they build them like on an incline instead of more flat, if it's supposed to be for disabilities?
It's a good question, and I'm not an architect or a designer. So if there are any architects out there who know,
Can I chime in?
Please,
Yes, please.
please do.
This is David Abramson. So, but a barrier-free ramp is defined in codes by definition. It has to have it can't have more than 1 foot of rise and 12 feet of run. So that's, I think, about an 8.25% angle. It could be less than that, but it can't be more. It also has to have various kinds of handrails under circumstances, curbs or no curbs under certain circumstances, but that's defined by code. If it's steeper than that, which is problematic for someone in a wheelchair, it doesn't satisfy the code requirement.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Sure.
Perfect timing for that answer. Thank you, David. Yeah, no, I think that is a common kind of question about design features, right, with the ADA compliance and historic sites. And Bonnie kind of spoke to that. But I love, Nicole, what you're saying about bringing to the front and not hiding those resources and accessibility as a positive, right, at these sites. I had a question. I think you touched on it early on briefly, and maybe I was just kind of busy with the waiting room or something. You said that people should stay abreast of the latest appropriate language for discussing disability. I think that's always really helpful to better understand, as practitioners or people doing events, et cetera. So could you explain what kind of is the most current appropriate language and how people should be communicating? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate that I do not identify as disabled. And so the best thing you can do is to ask a disabled person how they want to be referred to, because everyone will probably give you a different answer. So for example, some people like the phrase talk about disabled people. Some people prefer people with disabilities. It varies. And I think I put into the chat a language link earlier, which is something that I refer to all the time. Because the language is always changing. I personally can't keep up with it. I forget things a lot. Something that I hear a lot and that you actually see in the news a lot, one thing to keep in mind is to try to stay away from using anything related to disability as a metaphor. So for example, a common type of news headline might be something like winter storm cripples Northeast. And that is an example of using a historic term to refer to a disabled person that is now outdated, and using it metaphorically. And that term is no longer acceptable because it's been used in the past to exclude disabled people from society. So another example of a phrase you want to stay away from is something like, I was blind to the problem of X. So again, just try to stay away from metaphors related to disability because lots of people find them offensive. But again, it really depends on the person and the situation, but that particular website and training through places like Artreach can really help give you some guidance on that.
That's great. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I just want to say one more thing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, if you are talking about history and you're using historic terms, then obviously it's fine to use those terms historically, as long as you explain yourself.
Got it. Thanks. No, thanks for clarifying that. And Bonnie says something in the chat. Use people first language is also suggested. Okay.
Yeah, and that's discussed in that style guide.
Great. I think
Bonnie.
there's so many good resources in this chat that after we end the session and we download the Zoom and download the chat, we will I'll kind of take all those and copy them and send them out into an email to everybody, because it just seems like really rich resources. Yeah, I'm like, wow, there's a lot. I was trying to kind of copy it down while we're talking, but I'll just do it afterwards. There's so much in the chat. And Nicole, I think that I've gotten some private messages from people like, this is really helpful and interesting. Like, can you put your, would you mind putting your email address in the chat so people could reach out to you if they had further questions? I think that this seems like something that a lot of people are really interested in and working to do better. And I know this session we are going to, Nicole is going, she sent me a resource for how we can do the video with a transcript. I was kind of relying on our closed captioning from YouTube because you can set the language, but there's another resource that we will investigate. And this might take us a moment longer to post, but when we do, it will be accessible because we'll try to do our best with that resource Nicole's provided us. Yep, you go.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I put in my chat my email, which is all lowercase, Nicole, Nicole, Belolan, B as in boy, ELOLA, N as in Nancy, at rutgers.edu. And anyone's welcome to contact me with questions or, tell me about what you're doing at your historic site so I can use it as an example for others.
Great. And it looks like somebody also posted another example from Milton Smith. Some historic properties do not lend themselves to permanent outdoor ramp or lift. In some instances, the local code official might allow use of a portable wheelchair lift. Okay, so different options that are out there. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. First, thank you so much, Nicole, for speaking with us. I think this was a really interesting discussion. Sometimes we have more kind of back and forth, and I think this was one of those that I think turned into a good conversation. So thank you so much. I am going to just quickly share my screen here so that you can see what our upcoming events are. Slideshow. Okay. Okay, our next event is on March 4th at 1 p.m. It is going to be Q&A with P&J county level supports for historic preservation. And we're going to have 3 members of the Somerset County Division of Planning with us. So it'll be kind of our first panel style Preservation New Jersey Q&A event, which will be pretty interesting. So please sign up on our website. It's preservationnj.org/events. I also hope that you can, continue to join with us. I saw some familiar faces today, some new faces. Preservation New Jersey is member supported. We offer different types of memberships, family, business, individual.